Hello there, what do you hear? What do you say? Sankazer here, and today I'd like to talk about the meaning of life. What is the meaning of life? It's a question that's puzzled humanity for eons at this point, really. There are ancient philosophies, modern thinkers, and all of them have tried to give an answer to this very perennial question of ours. And I think the best place to start is with the Greeks, like with anything else in life, I suppose. Um, Socrates and Plato, they had a huge panoply of works attributed to them about political philosophy, about ethics, about metaphysics, about free will. But in this particular video, we're going to be talking about the meaning of life. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Through the dialogues, he and his student Plato emphasized the pursuit of virtue and self knowledge as the keys to a meaningful life. So, for them, virtue is integral to the idea of a meaningful life, right? Later on, we have Aristotle, right? And he introduces this concept called eudaimonia. And it has a very difficult translation, but the closest translation in English seems to be flourishing or happiness or something analogous to that sort of vein, right? Um, for Aristotle, living a life of virtue in accordance with reason was the highest goal. And you also have various Eastern philosophies as well. In Eastern philosophies, Buddhism can teach us that life is permeated by suffering. This is adhered to and believed by almost everyone, right? And but the thing about Buddhism that sort of makes it sort of unique and sort of transformative is that suffering is the sort of it takes center stage, so to speak, right? The Four Noble Truths guide us to overcoming suffering and achieving enlightenment. That's seen as the ultimate meaning of life, right? Now, there are certain modern perspectives on Buddhism. So, for example, the Dalai Lama, right? He says that the purpose of life is to be happy, right? Now, whether or not this is in accordance with Orthodox Buddhism remains to be seen, but this idea of sort of overcoming suffering and sort of overcoming the sort of life's trials and tribulations, this seems to be a pretty integral part of Buddhism. Hinduism, another major Eastern philosophy, speaks of a concept called dharma, right, which can be sort of roughly translated as duty, and moksha, which can be thought of as liberation, right? The meaning of life is to fulfill one's duty and ultimately achieve liberation from the cycle of rebirth, right? There's a there's an Indian man named Swami Vivekananda. I'm probably butchering his name. I apologize. And his stated goal and his stated idea is that the ultimate goal of human life is to realize God, right? And this sort of takes us into a sort of central idea, right? That traditionally, the meaning of life was bound up with the idea of divinity, right? And so Christianity, right? Life's purpose can be seen as sort of serving God, worshiping God, loving God, right? And it's typically inspired by the teachings, sayings, or parables of Jesus Christ, right? The promise of eternal life gives a sort of profound sense of meaning and hope, right? The Jesus Christ advocates loving one another as I have loved you, right? So this idea of sort of like loving God and loving others, right? This is what it sort of takes center stage, right? Islam comes along and there's a similar sort of idea, right? Except there's a sort of renewed emphasis on God, right? There isn't really anything analogous to sort of Jesus in Islam, right? Even though you do have Muhammad, Muslims don't worship Muhammad, right? In Islam, the meaning of life is to worship Allah and live in accordance with His guidance, right? The five pillars of Islam provide a sort of framework for living a meaningful life, with the ultimate goal being to get into heaven, right? For the afterlife, right? And there's a very famous Quran verse that basically sort of affirms this sort of idea, right? And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me, right? So this is basically saying the sort of teleology or end of human beings to sort of worship God and sort of follow His commands, right, so to speak, right? Judaism emphasizes living in accordance with God's commandments and values such as justice, community, and kindness, right? The covenant with God is what gives us a meaningful existence, right? And Hillel has a quote basically affirming the idea that what is hateful to you, you do not do to your neighbor, right? Now, this sort of, we are sort of paraphrasing a huge sort of chunk of history, right? And we're basically skipping over to the modern era. I suppose it should be said at the outset. Although it's kind of obvious, right? I'm going over sort of these. I'm pacing like I'm painting massive broad strokes, right, and sort of paraphrasing things and making things a bit more simplistic, right. Obviously, all of these religions are like much more nuanced and much more in depth, but just for the purposes of this video, we're just going to keep it short and sweet. So with respect to modern perspectives, right, we have existentialism, right. So this is an idea and philosophy that became very prominent in the 20th century, and its originator was sort of John Paul Sartre, right. Existentialists like John Paul Sartre argue that life has no inherent meaning, but it's up to us to create our own meaning through choices and actions. Now, this is a very, very modernist idea, right? The idea that meaning isn't a feature of the world, it's a feature of our minds, right? It's something that we project onto the world, not something that we sort of see in the world, right? And this is sort of encapsulated by a very famous quote of his called, "Man is condemned to be free." Albert Camus, another existentialist, introduced the concept of the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and the indifferent universe, right? He suggests that we find meaning in the struggle itself, right? The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. But the thing is that there's another quote that sort of encapsulates this idea, and I think it does so very poignantly. And it's a quote by, I think, Steven Weinberg, and it basically goes to this effect, right? The more we discover about the universe, the more it seems pointless, right? Or the more indifferent things seem, right? There's the idea that as our technology grows, as our scientific advances grow more and more, teleology and sort of like purposefulness in nature becomes more and more eroded, more and more sort of like put to the backside, more and more basically undermined, so to speak, right? And this sort of takes us to an idea that wasn't really found in the ancients. So this is the idea of nihilism, right? Nihilism, often seen as a sort of bleak view, posits that life is without any objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value at all, right? And it's sort of interesting because depending on how you sort of characterize the view, there are philosophers who endorse it, right? Now, obviously, there are philosophers who endorse pretty much every position, right? But the idea of nihilism, the idea that there are no sort of like stance-independent meanings, purposes, values at all, right? This is not that unpopular a position. So this can sort of be encapsulated by the quote that life has no meaning the moment you lose the illusion of being eternal, right? Now, this can sort of take us to one of the sort of central responses to nihilism and existentialism and so forth, and this is the idea of humanism, right? Humanism places sort of center stage on human values and the potential for individuals to find meaning via reason, ethics, and personal fulfillment, and it sort of encourages and advocates for a life driven by empathy and sort of self-improvement. Now, this can sort of be encapsulated by a man who isn't a philosopher, but was still a very influential person. And the purpose of life is to contribute in some ways to making things better, by Robert F. Kennedy. And yeah, so even though there are sort of like other sort of strands and sort of more scientific views, you could say, such as positive psychology and evolutionary biology and as such, right? In this video, we're just going to be focusing exclusively on the philosophies of the question, the meaning of life, right? We're sort of looking at it from a sort of philosophical lens and philosophical perspective and just sort of contemplating it therein, right? So yeah, what is the meaning of life to you? Just reflect on your own beliefs and your experiences and share your thoughts in the comments below if you want to. And yeah, please just whenever you can, hit a like, hit a subscribe, share it with other people if you wish. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Take care. And this is Sankazer signing off.